Dear students, in the last class we have discussed that environmentalism is a political philosophy which helps in bringing people together for the collective mobilization and makes them a part of the environmental movement. We also discussed that environmentalism is widespread, it is diverse and multifaceted. In today's class we will discuss basically various types or dimensions of environmentalism, and we will follow Ramchandra Guha and Joan Mattinez-Allier's framework where they discuss about varieties of environmentalism. I am referring to their book Varieties of Environmentalism, Essays in North and South, and we will discuss that how environmentalism differs in different parts of the world, how it manifests itself in the first world countries or in the developed countries, industrialized countries, and how it functions or how does it manifest in the third world societies or in the developing country societies. So in today's class, this module titled as Multiple Environmentalism basically discusses two broad types or two broad categories of environmentalism, environmentalism of the north and environmentalism of the south. The broad objective of today's class is to explore varieties of environmentalism across the world and to discuss the differences in their origin, articulation and ideology. This module also aims to explain the relationship between material and post-material connections in the emergence of environmentalism. After successfully completing this module, you will be able to understand the fundamental differences in issues, articulations of environmentalism and environmental movements in Western industrialized countries and that of the developing societies of the third world. In today's class, we will basically discuss about three main topics. We will begin with a discussion about multiple environmentalism, where we will discuss broadly the two broad varieties of environmentalism. Secondly, we will discuss the post-material values and rise of environmentalism, where we will discuss that how the post-material ideas or post-material values resulted in emergence of environmentalism in the industrialized countries of Western Europe and Northern America. And in the third part of this lecture, we will discuss about global environmentalism as a critique to the post-material hypothesis, where we will discuss that whether post-material hypothesis can be considered as a causal factor for emergence of environmentalism in the developing societies or in the third world societies. Let us begin with the first part of this class, that is multiple environmentalism, or where we will discuss two broad categories or two broad types of environmentalism. Following Ramchandra Guha and Joan Mattinez-Allier's, we may broadly divide or distinguish environmentalism into two categories: environmentalism in the north or the northern environmentalism and environmentalism of the south or the southern environmentalism. So the basic difference between these two categories of environmentalism is that northern environmentalism or environmentalism which is present in the global north or industrialized countries of the global north, they revolve around issues of industrial pollution. So these are single issue movements where which emerge in a post-material context, in the sense that throughout the process of industrialization or throughout the process of industrial growth, environment or environmental factors did not occur significantly in the developed societies. It is only from 1960s onwards or from the 60s and late 70s that we find emergence of environmental movements in different parts of the world. Whereas we all know that environmental degradation continued simultaneously along with industrial revolution. So for almost 200 years, there was silence about environmental issues and environmental concerns in the developed societies, even though environmental degradation continued hand in hand with industrial revolution. So industrial revolution or industrialization continued along with environmental degradation, but environmental degradation became an issue, or it became a public issue only in the recent times, and in that sense environmentalism emerged in the developed societies as a post-material concern, as a post-industrial concern. And the basic issue of these varieties of environmentalism, or the basic issue of environmentalism in the north, revolves around the quality of life issues, or in other words, northern environmentalism seeks for it seeks for clean, beautiful and pristine environment or safe environment. Whereas when we come to the environmental ideas in the global south or environmental ideas in the third world societies or in the developing nations, we find that environmental movements here or the environmental ideology here revolves around the issue of livelihood. So here these movements emerge during the process of industrialization, or during the process of industrialization. So in that sense, there is a material connection, or there is a material context of these movements. So it is the capitalist development, livelihood and environment that linkage constitutes as major processes, as major issues of these environmental movements. And environmental movements in global south seeks for equal rights to environment and development. So therefore there are two broad categories of environmentalism or environmental ideas that prevails around the world. One that we find in the developed countries of the global north or western Europe and northern America, and the other that we find in the developing societies or in the global south.
So let us discuss how these two broad varieties of environmentalism are different from each other.
We may distinguish these two broad varieties of environmentalism based on their origin, based on their manifestation and nature of conflict, and based on the ideology. So let us see that how these two varieties of environmentalism differ from each other based on these three indicators, based on their origin, manifestation and ideology. So let us begin with the distinction in terms of origin. How environmentalism of the north or environmentalism in the industrialized countries of the global north are different from that of environmentalism in the global south or in the developing societies. The northern environmentalism or environmentalism in the western European nations or the Northern American countries are related to the emergence of post-materialism and post-industrial society. As I just mentioned, that even though environmental degradation and industrial revolution continued simultaneously, there is a great silence in the western societies, or there is a great silence in the industrialized societies regarding environmental degradation. It is only recently that when society has already been industrialized, in the post-industrial context, there has been discussions about environmental concerns or about environmental problems. So these kind of environmental movements emerge in the developed societies in a post-industrial context. So with achievement of mass prosperity, attention gradually shifted from physical sustenance to that of quality of life issues in the developed world. So now that these developed societies, these industrial societies have achieved substantial progress, have achieved substantial economic growth, now the major concern for these societies or the major issue for these societies is not with the sustenance, is not with the livelihood. The issue for them now is quality of life, and environmental movements emerge in these societies in this context for requirement for a better quality of life. So the mass consumeristic society consumerist society enlarged the opportunities for leisure and means to access nature and leisure, and the desire to spend time in nature. So as societies progressed from that of industrialized societies to that of post-industrial societies, a gradual prosperity has taken place in society, mass prosperity has taken place in society, and the mass consumeristic society has enlarged the opportunities for leisure for the people. Now people are prosperous, society is prosperous, and they have a lot of time for leisure, and people now want to spend their leisure time with nature. And this idea or this ideology of spending time with nature or spending leisure time with nature created or led to emergence of larger support for preservation of nature. Now that people have resources, now that people have leisure time, they want to spend their time in nature. They want to spend their time in forests, they want to spend their time in nature reserves, and for that matter they want to preserve the forest, for that matter they want to preserve the wilderness. So the wilderness preservation or preserving the wild comes from the basic fact that people want to spend their time or people want to spend their leisure time with nature. So it is this desire for a better quality of life, this desire for a safe and this desire for a better environment that led to emergence of environmental movements in the global north. Now when we come to the environmental movements in the global south or origin of environmental movements in the global south, we realize that these movements or environmental movements in the global south emerge during the production process. They emerge during the process of industrialization or along with the process of industrialization. Unlike the global north, where there is a great silence about environmental degradation during the process of industrialization, in the global south, environmental issues emerge as major problems, environmental issues emerge as major concerns during the process of industrialization or along with the process of industrialization. Here, nature-based conflicts emerge as the roots of protest, and these kind of conflicts, these kind of environmental movements in the global south or in the developing societies originated or their origin lies in lopsided, iniquitous and environmentally destructive process of development. So in that sense, these movements originated in the context of a visible ecological degradation, and we need to understand the material context of these movements in order to understand their origin. As Ramchandra Goa says, that the material context of the origin of these environmental movements in the global south lies in the shortage of, threat to and struggle over natural resources. So essentially there is a link between environmental degradation, loss of livelihood and environmental movement or origin of environmental ideas, that in this part of the world environmental movements emerged because of loss of livelihood, which is again a result of environmental degradation. In that sense, that industrialization process resulted in degradation of nature, and degradation of nature created an insecurity in livelihood, and therefore this insecurity in livelihood and degradation of nature are essentially related, and there lies the origin of environmental movements and environmental ideas in global south. So to understand the emergence of environmental movements in the global south, we need to understand the basic linkage between environmental degradation and the loss of livelihood. In that sense, there is an intrinsic relationship between livelihood and or loss of livelihood and environmental degradation. So therefore livelihood environment linkage is central to understand the grassroots environmentalism in the global south. So whenever there is an environmental degradation, that leads to livelihood insecurity for the people, and livelihood insecurity leads to a social and environmental mobilization against the process of industrialization and for protection of nature or protection of environment. So therefore the major factors for mobilization or major factors for environmental mobilization in these countries or in the global south lies in direct experience of ecological degradation and the loss of livelihood. So therefore what is essential to understand the origin of environmental movement in this part of the world in the global south is the linkage between livelihood and environmental degradation. That environmental degradation leads to loss of livelihood, leads to livelihood insecurity, and livelihood insecurity results in greater mobilization against industrialization as well as against environmental degradation. Now let us discuss the difference between environmentalism in the north and environmentalism in the south in terms of the manifestation of conflict. With regard to environmental conflict, environmentalism in the north or northern environmentalism relies more on established social movement organizations, and these social movement organizations or these environmental movement organizations, they have their dedicated membership base, they have their dedicated leaders, supporters and dedicated finances. The method of conflict resolution or the method of redressal for these societies or in the developed societies is more democratic in nature. So therefore when we see environmental movements in the global north, we find that court cases, lobbying, pressure groups, recourse to media. So these are important ways in which these conflicts takes place. So therefore conflicts in or environmental conflicts in the global north are more formal or more democratic, where the conflicts manifest itself or the conflict takes place with the help of organized social activity, organized collective mobilization. So in that sense, environmental movement organizations, social movement organizations, they play a great role in these environmental movements in the global north. Whereas when we come to the global south, we find that environmental movements in the global south relies more on direct action. They rely more on direct confrontation. So the methods of protest in this the methods of protest in the developing societies or in the environmentalism of the global south relies more on Gandhian techniques of protest. They are more non-violent. They are like Gandhian techniques like dharna, Gandhian techniques like padayatra, or Gandhian techniques of protest like satyagraha. They constitute the methods of protest or the language of protest in the in these developing societies. And the environmental movements in the developing societies rely more on traditional networks like the caste, kinship and ethnicity. These traditional networks are geared up to form collective mobilization. So therefore, environmental movements in the global south are more direct confrontation, where recourse to law, recourse to court may be considered as a supplement to the popular protest. So in that sense, we may realize that there is a difference between environmentalism in the global north and environmentalism in the global south. In the global north, while environmentalism are more formal, more democratic, with recourse to court cases, with recourse to lobbying, with recourse to putting pressure on the government, environmental movements in the global south, environmental ideas in the global south relies more on direct action, where collective mobilization it takes place, or where mobilization is formed based on networks of kinship, based on networks of caste and ethnicity. Thirdly, let us discuss the difference in terms of origin. As I told that environmental movements or environmental ideas in the global north and in the global south are different with respect to their ideological commitment, or with respect to the ideological orientations. The ideological orientations of northern environmentalism may be understood in this way, that these are mostly single issue movements. As I started my lecture today, that environmental movements in the global north mostly revolves around the issues of pollution. So in that sense, the ideological orientation of these movements calls for a change in attitude towards nature rather than a change in the mode of production. So what these movements ultimately demand, or what these movements ultimately call for, is to have a change in the attitude towards the nature. So therefore, these kind of movements, or these kind of environmental ideas in the global north runs parallel to the consumeristic society. So the consumeristic society or the industrial society is not considered as problematic for this environmental degradation, or for this environmental concerns. So emphasis is not on relationship between human society, rather between nature and the human society. So therefore, the central idea, or the central ideological orientation of environmental movements in the north is for having a better quality of life. So in that sense, the emphasis is a relationship between the nature and the human society. The relationship is between nature and human society, because human society as a whole desires, or they expect, a better quality of life, or a better or safe environment. So therefore, the national sovereignty in this case is challenged not from a vantage point of locality, but from the vantage point of the ecosystem. But when we come to the ideological orientation of environmental movements in the global south, or when we come to the ideological orientations of southern environmentalism, we find that these movements, or these environmental ideas are a clash over productive resources. So in that sense, these movements may be considered a third kind of class struggle, in the sense that the first kind of class struggle was fought in the land, where it was a conflict between those who have land and those who do not have access to land. The second kind of class struggle was fought in the factory, where essentially the conflict was between the factory owners and the landlords, or from a Marxian perspective, the conflict was between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And these environmental movements may be considered as a third kind of class struggle, where the focus of conflict, or where the space of conflict has shifted from that of land to that of factory to that of nature. So therefore, now these conflicts takes place over nature, they takes place over forest, they takes place over water, they takes place over grazing land, they takes place over mineral resources, or in other words, they takes place over natural resources, where essentially two competing groups, they fight over each other. In that sense, as Ramchandra Guha argues, that these environmental movements are essentially a conflict between two different groups, or two different interests based on their access to the resource. In that sense, these are resource conflicts. These are conflicts to have equal share over resource. And in this case, in the global south, issues of equity, in this global south, issues of ecology are interlinked with questions of human rights, ethnicity and distributive justice. Unlike the environmental ideas of the global north, which I told they are single issue movements because they revolve around the issue of pollution, they revolve around the issue of better quality of life. Environmental movements in the global south are multifaceted movements, because in this case we find that environmental issues or environmental concerns are juxtaposed, they are combined with issues of human rights, with issues of ethnicity, with issues of gender and with issues of equal right over resources. In that sense, these are questions of distributive justice, these are questions of ethnicity, these are questions of human right. So basically these resource conflicts or these conflicts over natural resources essentially points the question how to share the resources. In that sense, these are distributional conflicts over resources. How do we distribute the resources? How do we distribute the benefits out of these resources? In that sense, ideologically, environmental movements in the global south call for a change in the mode of production, while in the global north it calls for a change in attitude towards the nature, because it is not conflict between two groups, it is a conflict for a better quality of life, it is a conflict for a better ecosystem. In the global south, it calls for a change in mode of production, it calls for a change in fundamental access to resources, access to the production process, or access to basic resources. In that sense, these conflicts essentially manifest itself as a conflict between two groups of people, between two interests. In that sense, conflicts here are not between, in that sense, environmental conflicts in the global south are conflicts between two human groups, or conflict between humans, whereas in the case of environmentalism in the north, we discussed that these are not conflicts between humans and or conflicts, not conflict between different human groups, but a conflict for a better nature, whereas in the global south these are conflict between two interest groups, conflict between two human groups who put forth unequal claim over the nature. So in that sense, these environmental movements in the global south may be considered as a defense of locality against the nation state. So therefore, when we see environmental movements in the global south, any environmental movement you may take, whether it may be case of Chipko, you may take the case of Namada movement, you may find that these movements are essentially against a capitalist state. So therefore, state becomes the enemy, state becomes the adversary in these kind of environmental struggles, whereas in the global north, the environmental movements are for a better quality of life. They are not against a particular interest, whereas in the global south, you may find that these kind of environmental struggles or these kind of ideologies put forth a kind of conflict, a kind of clash between two productive between two groups over a productive resource. So in that sense, unlike the global north, where consumeristic society ran parallelly to that of environmental movement, in the global south we find that these movements put forth a critique to the uncontrolled economic growth. These movements put forth a critique to the consumeristic society. To conclude and summarize this part of the lecture, we may find that there are two broad categories of environmentalism: environmental ideas that grew up, that inspired environmental movements in the global north, in the western industrialized countries or in the northern American countries, and environmental ideas that inspired environmental movements in the global south. The basic difference between these two environmentalism lies in their origin, their manifestation, and in their ideology. With regard to origin, environmental movements or environmental ideas in the global north emerge in the post-industrial context, because as I told that during the phase of industrialization there was almost a silence about environmental issues. There was no talk, no debates or discussions about environmental issues, and now that society has achieved prosperity, now that society has achieved a level of economic growth, there is a talk about environmental concerns, so there is a talk about environmental degradation. And what are the major issues? The issues here are for quality of life, the issues here are for safe environment, whereas in the global south we see that these movements are originating, or these movements are emerging along with the process of production, or therefore there is a material context over these movements. Environmental movements in the global south, environmental ideas in the global south which inspire these movements, they emerge in the context of certain material resources. So therefore the materiality, the physicality of environmental ideas in the global south are more significant than that of environmental movements in the global north. Secondly, we also discussed that with regard to manifestation, these two ideologies or these two ideas are different. Environmental ideas in the global north manifest itself in a more formal way, in a more democratic way, where these movements takes place with the help of organized protest groups, organized social movement organizations, well-established social movement organizations with well-established leadership, with well-established membership group. Whereas environmental movements in the global south or environmental ideas in the global south manifest themselves with traditional networks. So it is the direct action, direct confrontation that is the manifestation of environmental ideas in the global south. And thirdly, finally, with regard to ideology, there is a great difference between environmentalism in the global north and environmentalism in the global south. The central point to understand environmental ideas in the global south or in the developing societies or third world societies is the linkage between livelihood, capitalist development and environmental degradation. So here in this context, certain kind of capitalist development results in environmental degradation, like we have already discussed that capitalism results in environmental degradation. But the central thing to understand here, or the central thing to focus here, is that this environmental degradation creates a livelihood insecurity, and this livelihood insecurity becomes a major factor for environmental ideas or environmental concerns in the global south. So therefore we may conclude that it is the livelihood, capitalism and environmental degradation linkage that constitutes the major factor for environmental degradation in global south. But again, we need to understand that why is it that this linkage becomes important? Because in the global north there is a clear-cut separation between naturescape and humanscape. You will not find that human society is far removed from the nature. There is a clear-cut separation between nature and human society. So therefore human societies or society's dependence of nature is very minimal, whereas in the context of global south, society's dependence upon nature is extreme. There is a great dependence upon nature for livelihood, and it is this interconnection between society and nature which is mediated through the process of livelihood that is central to understand, to realize or to comprehend environmental movements in the global south. So any kind of environmental degradation results in an immediate loss of livelihood, immediate insecurity of livelihood in the global south, and that functions or that emerges as a major factor for environmental movements in global south.